Welcome back, everyone, to our final chapter book read-along of Witches by Roald Dahl. We are going to finish up our story today, but before we do, I want to do a quick review of what we have read so far. So, while we are doing our review, I want you to think about one question I have for you all. What was the reaction of Bruno's parents when Grandmama tried to tell them that their son had been turned into a mouse? All right, think on that. I'll ask you again at the end. Our story is about our main character and his grandmother. They are quite the pair, and his grandmother tells him all about real witches. Well, witches in these stories have certain clues to tell you that they are witches. They're always female. They wear gloves to hide their giant claws on their hands. They are always itching their heads because they're bald, so they wear wigs to cover up their baldness, and it makes their heads itchy. They have no pupils, and it's fire and ice in there. Their nostrils are extra big so they can smell out children. And they have no toes. Well, our main character sadly runs into a huge group of witches while he and his grandmother are at a hotel in England. It is an annual meeting of all the witches in England, led by the Grand High Witch herself. She is the worst of them. These witches have one thing that they do, and that is get rid of children. They hate children. Well, the Grand High Witch has a brilliant idea for making all of the children in England disappear. She is going to teach the other witches how to make a potion that will turn all of the children into mice with just one drop in candy or sweets, anything that these kids eat. Well, sadly, they use an example of a boy named Bruno Jenkins, and he gets turned into a mouse. They also catch our poor main character who was hiding in the back of this meeting, listening to all of the craziness happen. He also gets turned into a mouse. But luckily, his grandmother believes him and knows all about witches, and is going to take care of him no matter how small he is. Well, they have a brilliant idea to get rid of all the witches. They're going to steal a potion from the Grand High Witch's hotel room and put it in all of the witches' food and turn them into mice. Oh boy. Well, Grandmama lowers our main character in a little sock down the balcony to the Grand High Witch's room. He sneaks in and steals a bottle of the potion, and then sneaks into the kitchen and pours it into their soup. The whole thing. He almost gets caught on his way out of the kitchen. It was very scary. But now he is back with his grandmother, and they are waiting to see what is going to happen next. Well, we finally left them with Bruno's father walking up to Grandmama in the dining room. Now, you remember that question I just asked you? What was the reaction of Bruno's parents when Grandmama tried to tell them that their son had been turned into a mouse? Well, the dad did not believe her. He said she was crazy, and the mother was terrified. She hates mice, so she was screaming her head off. I have a feeling that this confrontation in the dining room might not go well. Well, let's see what happens next as we finish up Witches by Roald Dahl. Enjoy! Chapter 19, Mr. Jenkins and His Son. Mr. Jenkins came striding up to our table with a very purposeful look on his face. "Where is that grandson of yours?" he said to my grandmother. He spoke rudely and looked very angry. My grandmother put on her frostiest look, but didn't answer him. "My guess is that he and my son Bruno are up to some devilment," Mr. Jenkins went on. "Bruno hasn't turned up for his supper, and it takes a lot to make my boy miss his food." "I must admit he has a very healthy appetite," my grandmother said.
My feeling is that you're in on this as well, Mr. Jenkins said. I don't know who the devil you are, and I don't much care, but you played a nasty trick on me and my wife this afternoon. You put a dirty little mouse on the table. That makes me think all three of you are up to something. So if you know where Bruno's hiding, kindly tell me at once.
That was no trick I played on you, my grandmother said. That mouse I tried to give you was your own little boy, Bruno. I was being kind to you. I was trying to restore him to the bosom of his family. You refused to take him in.
What the blazes do you mean, madam? Shouted Mr. Jenkins. My son isn't a mouse.
His black mustache was jumping up and down like a crazy as he spoke.
Come on, woman, where is he? Out with it.
The family at the table nearest to us all had stopped eating and were staring at Mr. Jenkins. My grandmother sat there, puffing away calmly at her black cigar. I can well understand your anger, Mr. Jenkins, she said. Any other English father would be just as cross as you are. But over in Norway, where I come from, we are quite used to these sort of happenings. We've learnt to accept them as a part of everyday life.
You must be mad, woman, cried Mr. Jenkins. Where is Bruno? If you don't tell me at once, I shall summon the police.
Bruno is a mouse, my grandmother said, calm as ever.
He most certainly is not a mouse, shouted Mr. Jenkins.
Oh, yes, I am, Bruno said, poking his head up out of the handbag. Mr. Jenkins leapt about 3 feet into the air. Hello, Dad, Bruno said. He had a silly sort of mousy grin on his face. Mr. Jenkins' mouth dropped open so wide I could see the gold fillings in the back of his teeth. Don't worry, Dad, Bruno went on. It's not as bad as all that, just so long as the cat doesn't get me.
Bruno,
stammered Mr. Jenkins. No more school, said Bruno, grinning a broad and asinine mouse grin. No more homework. I shall live in the kitchen cupboard and feast on raisins and honey.
But Bruno, stammered Mr. Jenkins again. How did this happen?
The poor man had no wind left in his sails at all. Witches, my grandmother said. The witches did it.
I can't have a mouse for a son, shrieked Mr. Jenkins.
Well, you've got one, my grandmother said. Be nice to him, Mr. Jenkins.
Mrs. Jenkins will go crazy, yelled Mr. Jenkins. She can't stand the things.
She'll just have to get used to him, my grandmother said. I hope you don't keep a cat in the house.
We do, cried Mr. Jenkins. Topsy is my wife's favourite creature.
Then you'll have to get rid of Topsy, my grandmother said. Your son is more important than your cat.
He certainly is, Bruno shouted from inside the handbag. You tell Mum she's got to get rid of Topsy before I go home.
By now, half the dining room was watching our little group. Knives and forks and spoons had been put down all over the place, and heads were turning round to stare at Mr. Jenkins as he stood there sputtering and shouting. They couldn't see either Bruno or me, and they were wondering what all the fuss was about. By the way, my grandmother said, would you like to know who did this to him? There was a mischievous little smile in her face, and I could see that she was about to get Mr. Jenkins into trouble.
Who? He cried. Who did it?
That woman over there, my grandmother said, the small one in the black dress at the head of the long table.
She's our SPCC, cried Mr. Jenkins. She's the chairwoman.
No, she's not, my grandmother said. She's the Grand High Witch of all the world.
You mean she did it? That skinny little woman over there? Shouted Mr. Jenkins, pointing at her with a long finger. By gad, I'll have my lawyers on her for this. I'll make her pay through the nose.
I wouldn't do anything rash, my grandmother said to him. That woman has magic powers. She might decide to turn you into something even sillier than a mouse. A cockroach, perhaps.
Turn me into a cockroach, shouted Mr. Jenkins, puffing out his chest. I'd like to see her try.
He swung round and started marching across the dining room towards the Grand High Witch's table. My grandmother and I watched him. Bruno had jumped up on our table and was also watching his father. Practically everyone in the dining room was watching Mr. Jenkins now. I stayed where I was, peeping out of grandmother's handbag. I thought it might be wiser to stay put. Chapter 20. The Triumph. Mr. Jenkins had not got more than a few paces towards the Grand High Witch's table when a piercing scream rose high above all the other noises in the room, and at the same moment I saw the Grand High Witch go shooting up into the air. Now she was standing on her chair, still screaming. Now she was on the tabletop, waving her arms. "What on earth is happening, Grandmama?" "Wait," my grandmother said. "Keep quiet and watch." Suddenly, all the other witches, more than 80 of them, were beginning to scream and jump out of their seats as though spikes were being stuck in their bottoms. Some were standing on chairs, some were up on tables, and all of them were wiggling about and waving their arms in the most extraordinary manner. Then all at once, they became quiet. Then they stiffened. Every single witch stood there, stiff and silent as a corpse. The whole room became deadly still. "They're shrinking, Grandmama," I said. "They're shrinking just like I did." "I know they are," my grandmother said. "It's the mouse maker," I cried. "Look, some of them are growing fur on their faces." "Why is it working so quickly, Grandmama?" "I'll tell you why," my grandmother said. "Because all of them have had massive overdoses, just like you. It's thrown the alarm clock right out of whack." Everyone in the dining room was standing up now to get a better view. People were moving closer. They were beginning to crowd around the two long tables. My grandmother lifted Bruno and me up so that we wouldn't miss out on all of the fun. In her excitement, she jumped up on her chair so that she could see over the heads of the crowd. In another few seconds, all the witches had completely disappeared, and the tops of the two long tables were swarming with small brown mice. All over the dining room, women were screaming, and strong men were turning white in the face and shouting, "It's crazy! This can't happen! Let's get out of here quick!" Waiters were attacking the mice with chairs and wine bottles and anything that came to hand. I saw a chef in a tall white hat rushing out from the kitchen, brandishing a frying pan, and another one was behind him, wielding a carving knife above his head, and everyone was yelling, "Mice! Mice! We must get rid of the mice!" Only the children in the room were really enjoying it. They all seemed to know instinctively that something good was going on here in front of them, and they were clapping and cheering and laughing like mad. "It's time to go," my grandmother said. "Our work is done." She got down off her chair and picked up her handbag and slung it over her arm. She had me in her right hand and Bruno in her left. "Bruno," she said, "its time has come to restore you to the famous bosom of your family." "My mum's not very crazy about mice," Bruno said. "So I've noticed," my grandmother said. "She'll just have to get used to you, won't she?" It was not difficult to find Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins. You could hear Mrs. Jenkins' shrill voice all over the room. "Herbert!" it was screaming. "Herbert, get me out of here! There's mice everywhere that go up my skirts!" She had her arms high up around her husband, and from where I was, she seemed to be swinging from his neck. My grandmother advanced upon them and thrust Bruno into Mr. Jenkins' hand. "Here's your little boy," she said. "He needs to go on a diet." "Hi, Dad," Bruno said. "Hi, Mum." Mrs. Jenkins screamed even louder. My grandmother, with me in her hand, turned and marched out of the room. She went straight across the hotel lobby and out through the front entrance into the open air. Outside, it was a lovely warm evening, and I could just hear the waves breaking on the beach across the road from the hotel. "Is there a taxi here?" my grandmother said to the tall doorman in his green uniform.
Certainly, madam, he said, and he put 2 fingers to his mouth and blew a long, shrill whistle. I watched him with envy. For weeks I had been trying to whistle like that, but I hadn't succeeded once. Now I never would. The taxi came. The driver was an oldish man with a thick, black, drooping mustache. The mustache hung over his mouth like the roots of some plant. "Where to, madam?" he asked. Suddenly he caught sight of me, a little mouse, nestling in my grandmother's hand. "Blimey," he said. "What's that?" "It's my grandson," my grandmother said. "Drive us to the station, please." "I always liked mice," the old taxi driver said. "I used to keep hundreds of them when I was a boy. Mice is the fastest breeders in the world. Did you know that, madam? So if he's your grandson, then I reckon you'll be having a few great-grandsons to go with him a couple of weeks at a time." "Drive us to the station, please," my grandmother said, looking prim. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Right away." My grandmother got into the back of the taxi and sat down and put me in her lap. "Are we going home?" I asked her. "Yes," she answered. "Back to Norway." "Hooray!" I cried. "Oh, hooray, hooray, hooray!" "I thought you'd like that," she said. "What about our luggage?" "Who cares about our luggage?" she said. The taxi was driving through the streets of Bournemouth, and this was the time of day when the pavements were crowded with holiday-makers, all wandering about aimlessly with nothing to do. "How are you feeling, my darling?" my grandmother said. "Fine," I said. "Quite marvelous." She began stroking the fur on the back of my neck with one finger. "We have accomplished great feats today," she said. "It's been terrific," I said. "Absolutely terrific." Chapter 21. The Heart of a Mouse. It was lovely to be back in Norway once again in my grandmother's fine old house. But now that I was so small, everything looked different, and it took me quite a while to find my way around. Mine was a world of carpets and table legs and chair legs and the little crannies behind large pieces of furniture. A closed door could not be opened, and nothing could be reached that was on the table. But after a few days, my grandmother began to invent gadgets for me in order to make life a bit easier. She got a carpenter to put together a number of slim, tall stepladders, and she placed one of them against each table in the house, so that I could climb up whenever I wanted to. She herself invented a wonderful door-opening device made out of wires and springs and pulleys, with heavy weights and dangling on cords, and soon every door in the house had a door opener on it. All I had to do was press my front paws on a tiny wooden platform, and hey, presto! A spring would stretch and a weight would drop, and the door would swing open. Next, she rigged up an equally ingenious system whereby I could switch on a light whenever I entered the room at night. I cannot explain how it worked, because I don't know about electricity, but there was a little button let into the floor near the door in every room of the house, and when I pressed the button gently with one paw, the light would come on. When I pressed it a second time, the light would go off again. My grandmother made me a tiny toothbrush using a matchstick for a handle, and into it she stuck little bits of bristle that she had snipped off of one of her hairbrushes. "You must not get any holes in your teeth," she said. "I can't take a mouse to the dentist. He'd think I'm crazy." "It's funny," I said, "but ever since I became a mouse, I've hated the taste of sweets and chocolate, so I don't think I'll get any holes." "You're still going to brush your teeth after every meal," my grandmother said, and I did. For a bathtub, she gave me a silver sugar basin, and I bathed in it every night before going to bed. She allowed no one else into the house, not even a servant or a cook. We kept entirely to ourselves, and we were very happy in each other's company. One evening, as I lay on my grandmother's lap in front of the fire, she said to me, "I wonder what happened to that little Bruno." "I wouldn't be surprised if his father gave him to the hall porter to drown in a fire bucket," I answered. "I'm afraid you might be right,"
my grandmother said. Poor little thing. We were silent for a few minutes, my grandmother puffing away at her black cigar, while I dozed comfy in her warmth. Can I ask you something, Grandmama? I said. Ask me anything you like, my darling. How long does a mouse live? Ah, she said. I've been waiting for you to ask that. There was a silence. She sat there, smoking away and gazing at the fire. Well, I said, how long do we live, us mice? I have been reading about mice, she said. I have been trying to find out everything I can about them. Go on then, Grandmama. Why don't you tell me? If you really want to know, she said, I'm afraid a mouse doesn't live a very long time. How long? I asked. Well, an ordinary mouse only lives for about 3 years, she said. But you are not an ordinary mouse. You are a mouse person, and that is a very different matter. How different? I asked. How long does a mouse person live, Grandmama? Longer, she said. Much longer. How much longer? I asked. A mouse person will almost certainly live for 3 times as long as an ordinary mouse, my grandmother said. About 9 years. Good, I cried. That's great. That's the best news I've ever heard. Why do you say that? She asked, surprised. Because I would never want to live longer than you, I said. I couldn't stand being looked after by anybody else. There was a short silence. She had a way of funneling me behind the ears with the tip of one finger. It felt lovely. How old are you, Grandmama? I asked. I'm 86, she said. Will you live another 8 or 9 years? I might, she said, with a bit of luck. You've got to, I said, because by then I'll be a very old mouse and you'll be a very old grandmother, and soon after we'll both die together. That would be perfect, she said. I had a little doze after that. I just shut my eyes and thought of nothing and felt peace with the world. Would you like me to tell you something about yourself that's very interesting? My grandmother said. Yes, please, Grandmama, I said without opening my eyes. I couldn't believe it at first, but apparently it's quite true. What is it? I asked. The heart of a mouse, she said, and that means your heart is beating at the rate of 500 times a minute. Isn't that amazing? That's not possible, I said, opening my eyes wide. It's as true as I'm sitting here, she said. It's a sort of miracle. That's nearly 9 beats every second, I cried, working it out in my head. Correct, she said. Your heart is going so fast, it's impossible to hear the separate beats. All one hears is a soft humming sound. She was wearing a lace dress, and the lace kept tickling my nose. I had to rest my head on my front paws. Have you ever heard my heart humming away, Grandmama? I asked her. Often, she said. I hear it when you're lying very close to me on the pillow at night. The two of us remained silent in front of the fire for a long time after that, thinking about these wonderful things. My darling, she said at last, are you sure you don't mind being a mouse for the rest of your life? I don't mind at all, I said. It doesn't matter who you are or what you look like, so as long as somebody loves you. Chapter 22. It's off to work we go. For supper that evening, my grandmother had a plain omelet and 1 slice of bread. I had a piece of that brown Norwegian goat's milk cheese known as joist, which I had loved even when I was a boy. We ate in front of the fire, my grandmother in her armchair, and me on the table with my cheese on a small plate. Grandmama, I said, now that we have done away with the Grand High Witch, will all the other witches in the world gradually disappear? I'm quite sure they won't, she answered. I stopped chewing and stared at her. But they must, I cried. Surely they must. I'm afraid not, she said. But if she's not there any longer, how are they going to get all the money they need? And who is going to give them orders and jazz them up at annual meetings and invent all their magic formulas for them? When a queen bee dies, there is always another queen in the hive ready to take her place, my grandmother said. It's the same with witches. In the great headquarters where the Grand High Witch lives, there is always another Grand High Witch waiting in the wings to take over should anything happen. Oh no! I cried. That means everything we did was for nothing. Have I become a mouse for nothing at all? We saved the children of England, she cried. I don't call that nothing. I know, I cried. But that's not nearly good enough. I felt sure that all the witches of the world would slowly fade away after we had got rid of their leader. Now you tell me that everything is going to go on same as before? Not exactly as before, my grandmother said. For instance, there are no longer any witches in England. That's quite a triumph, isn't it? But what about the rest of the world? I cried. What about America and France and Holland and Germany? And what about Norway? You must not think I have been sitting back and doing nothing these last few days, she said. I have been giving a great deal of thought and time to that particular problem. I was looking up at her face when she said this, and all at once I noticed that a little secret smile was beginning to spread slowly around her eyes and the corners of her mouth. Why are you smiling, Grandmamma? I asked her. I have some rather interesting news for you, she said. What news? Shall I tell you right from the beginning? Yes, please, I said. I like good news. She had finished her omelette, and I had had enough of my cheese. She wiped her lips with a napkin and said, As soon as we arrived back in Norway, I picked up a telephone and made a call to England. Who in England, Grandmamma? To the Chief of Police of Bournemouth, my darling. I told him I was the Chief of Police for all of Norway, and that I was interested in the particular happenings that had taken place recently at the Hotel Magnificent. Now hold on a sec, Grandmamma, I said. There's no way an English policeman is going to believe that you are the head of the Norwegian police. I am very good at imitating a man's voice, she said. Of course he believed me. The policeman in Bournemouth was honoured to get a call from the Chief of Police of the whole of Norway. So what did you ask him? I asked him for the name and address of the lady who had been living in room 454 at the Hotel Magnificent, the one who had disappeared. You mean the Grand High Witch? I cried. Yes, my darling. And did he give it to you? Naturally he gave it to me. One policeman will always help another policeman. By golly, you've got nerve, Grandmamma. I wanted her address, my grandmother said. But did he know her address? He did indeed. They had found her passport in her room, and her address was on it. It was also in the hotel register. Everyone who stays in the hotel has to put a name and address in that book. But surely the Grand High Witch wouldn't put her real name and address in the hotel register, I said. Why ever not? My grandmother said. Nobody in the world had the faintest idea who she was except the other witches. Wherever she went, people simply knew her as a nice lady. You, my darling, and you alone, were the only non-witch ever to see her with her mask off. Even in her home district, in the village where she lived, people knew her as a kindly and very wealthy baroness who gave large sums of money to charity, and I have checked up on that. I was getting excited now. And that address you've got, Grandmamma, that must have been the secret headquarters of the Grand High Witch. It still is, my grandmother said, and that will be where the new Grand High Witch is certain to be living at this very moment with her routine of special assistant witches. Important rulers are always surrounded by a large group of assistants. Where is her headquarters, Grandmamma? I cried. Tell me quick, where is it? It's a castle, my grandmother said, and the fascinating thing is that in that castle will be all the names and addresses of all the witches in the world. How else could a Grand High Witch run her business? How else could she summon the witches of various countries to their annual meetings? Where is the castle, Grandmamma? I cried impatiently. Which country? Tell me quick. Guess, she said. Norway, I cried. Right first time, she answered, high up in the mountains above a small village. This was thrilling news. I did a little dance of excitement on the tabletop. My grandmother was getting pretty worked up herself, and now she heaved herself out of her chair and began pacing up and down the room, thumping the carpet with her stick. So we have work to do, you and I, she cried out. We have a great task ahead of us. Thank heavens you're a mouse. A mouse can go anywhere. All I'll have to do is put you down somewhere near the Grand High Witch's castle, and you will very easily be able to get inside it and creep around looking and listening to your heart's content. I will, I answered. No one will ever see me. Moving about in a big castle will be child's play compared to the crowded kitchen full of cooks and waiters. You will spend days in there if necessary, my grandmother cried. In her excitement, she was waving her stick all over the place, and suddenly she knocked over a tall and very beautiful vase that went crashing to the floor and smashed into a million pieces. Forget it, she said. It's only Ming. You could spend weeks in the castle if you wanted to, and they'd never know you were there. I myself would get a room in the village, and you could sneak out of the castle and have supper with me every night and tell me what's going on. I could, I cried out, and inside the castle I could go snooping around simply everywhere. But your main job, of course, my grandmother said, would be to destroy every witch in the place. That really would be the end of the whole organization. Me? Destroy them? I cried. How could I do that? Can't you guess? She said. Tell me, I said. Mouse maker, my grandmother shouted. Formula 86 delayed action mouse maker all over again. You'll feed it to everyone in the castle by putting drops in their food. You do remember the recipe, don't you? Every bit of it, I answered. You mean we're going to make it ourselves? Why not? She cried. If they can make it, so can we. It's just a question of knowing what goes into it. Who's going to climb the tall trees and get the Gruntle's eggs? I asked her. I will, she cried. I'll do it myself. There's plenty of life in this old dog yet. I think I'd better do that part, Grandmama. You might become a cropper. Those are just details, she cried, waving her stick again. We shall let nothing stand in our way. And what happens after that? I asked her. After the new Grand High Witch and everyone else in the castle has turned into mice? Then the castle will be completely empty, and I shall come in and join you and... Wait, I cried. Hold on, Grandmama. I've just had a nasty thought. What nasty thought? She said. When the mouse maker turned me into a mouse, I said, I didn't become just an ordinary mouse that you could catch in mouse traps. I became a talking, thinking, intelligent mouse, person who wouldn't go near a mouse trap. My grandmother stopped dead in her tracks. She already knew what was coming next. Therefore, I went on, if we use the mouse maker and turn the new Grand High Witch and all the other witches in the castle into mice, the whole place will be swarming with very clever, very nasty, very dangerous, talking, thinking mouse witches. They'll all be witches in mouse clothing, and that, I added, could be very horrible indeed. By golly, you're right, she cried. That never occurred to me. I couldn't possibly take on a castle full of mouse witches, I said. Nor could I, she said. They've had to be gotten rid of at once. They'll have to be smashed and bashed and chopped up in little pieces exactly as they were at the Hotel Magnificent. I'm not doing that, I said. I couldn't anyway. I don't think you could either, Grandmama. And mouse traps wouldn't be the slightest use. By the way, I added, the Grand High Witch who did me in was wrong about mouse traps, wasn't she? Yes, my grandmother said impatiently, but I'm not concerned with that Grand High Witch. She's been chopped up long ago by the hotel chef. That's the new Grand High Witch that we've got to deal with now, the one up in the castle, and all her assistants. A Grand High Witch is bad enough when she's disguised as a lady, But think of what she could do if she were a mouse. She could go anywhere. I've got it, I shouted, leaping about a foot in the air. I've got the answer. Tell me, my grandmother snapped. The answer is cats, I shouted. Bring on the cats. My grandmother stared at me. Then a great grin spread out over her face and she shouted, It's brilliant! Absolutely brilliant! Shove a half a dozen cats into the castle, I cried, and they'll kill every mouse in the place in 5 minutes. I don't care how clever you are. You're a magician, my grandmother shouted, starting to wave her stick about once again. Look out for those vases, Grandmama. To heck with the vases, she shouted. I'm so thrilled I don't care if I break the lot. Just one thing, I said. You've got to make it absolutely sure I'm well out of the way before you put the cats in. That's a promise, she said. What will we do after the cats have killed all the mice? I'll take all the cats back to the village, and then you and I will have the castle completely to ourselves. And then, I said, then we shall go through the records and get the names and addresses of all the witches in the whole wide world. And after that, I said, quivering with excitement, after that, my darling, the greatest task of all will begin for you and me. We shall pack our bags and go travelling all over the world. In every country we visit, we shall seek out the houses where the witches are living. We shall find each house one by one, and having found it, you will creep inside and leave your little drops of deadly mouse maker in the bread, or the cornflakes, or the rice pudding, or whatever food you see lying about. It will be a triumph, my darling, a colossal, unbeatable triumph. We shall do it entirely by ourselves, just you and me. And that will be our work for the rest of our lives. My grandmother picked me up off the table and kissed me on the nose. Oh, goodness me, we're going to be busy these next few weeks and months and years, she cried. I think we are, I said, but what fun and excitement it's going to be. You can say that again, my grandmother cried, giving me another kiss. I can't wait to get started. The end. All right, everyone, I hope you enjoyed the end of our book. Let's discuss those last chapters that we just read. In chapter 19, Mr. Jenkins and his son, do you think Mr. Jenkins will ever truly believe what happened to his son? I hope so. I mean, he saw all the other witches turn into mice, so one would think he would eventually believe it, right? What do you think the Grand High Witch would have done if Mr. Jenkins had gotten to confront her? What do you think? I don't think it would have ended well. Remember, she had that crazy, beam vision that could turn somebody into dust? That probably could have happened. Our next chapter was chapter 20, The Triumph. Do you think the witches realized that they ate their own potion? I don't think they realized it until it started working. Whew, that might have been why they were screaming so loud. They were terrified and they knew what was happening. What do you think? Do you think that our main character could be turned back into a boy in Norway? I don't think so. I think that, sadly, their witches in this book, their potions are pretty permanent, aren't they? But I was glad that he and his grandmama got to go back to Norway and were very happy there. In chapter 21, Heart of a Mouse, what were some of the ways that Grandmama adapted her house to help the main character now that he's a little mouse? Well, she had someone build little ladders, up tables, You can see him going up the little ladder, and you can see like the pulley system. And so he just had to step on a little button to open the door. She made him a little toothbrush, and he's taking a bath in a sugar bowl. She also had somebody make little switches down on the floor so he could turn lights on and off, which was pretty cool. In chapter 22, It's Off to Work We Go, we find out what their plans are for the rest of their lives. Can you think of reasons why Grandmama would want to know where the Grand High Witch lived? She was sneaky, wasn't she? She called the police officer in the town in England where they were at, and she convinced him that she needed the address. Sneaky lady. So that she could find the witch and they could stop her for good. So if they stopped it at the Grand High Witch's house, then it meant there were no more to replace the Grand High Witch. Do you think it's going to be easy or hard for our main character to get inside the Grand Witch's castle? I think it's going to be a little harder than they made it out. But if you think about, castles, they're usually older, right? So maybe there's a couple other little nooks and crannies he can sneak into. And he got in and out of those doors pretty quickly, even when there were a lot of people at the hotel. So maybe it will be really easy. I hope it is. So, Grandmama and our main character will be making the witch's potion. Do you think they'll be able to make it? I think they will. Our main character listened really closely when the Grand High Witch gave the instructions. So they will be able to put it together and turn all the witches in the world into mice. As Grandmama and our main character travel from country to country, how do you think they'll locate other witches and where they live? So they talked a little bit about that they're going to get all the addresses from the Grand High Witch's castle. Because how else would she get their addresses for their annual meeting, right? They all met once a year. I have one more thing. Did you think it was a little odd that we never learned the name of our main character? It was always in his point of view, so he was saying I and me, but they never said his name. Not once. I don't think I've ever read a book before that the main character's name was never said. Now, I know Jeanette, who helped us put all these questions and things together, so thank you for that, she looked at the movie and his name was Jason in the movie. So maybe they just kind of made it up. I know there's a new movie out there too. You'll have to let me know what they named him there. But Roald Dahl, the author, decided never to name him. I think that was interesting. Well, I hope you enjoyed this story and our discussion along with it, and we will see you next time with our new chapter book read along. We're going to read Wizard of Oz. All right. Bye, everyone.